On this group, I know we're going to have a lot of questions from the audience, so we're going to keep the discussion sort of limited. We're a little different panel here with some very, they're really very smart on certain subjects, and we're kind of flopping all over the place as far as who we've got up here. So a good mix as well up here as far as legal and risk management is concerned. And our next guest has cleaned up people's messes, whether it's in the grandstand or their legal issues. A founding member of the Apollo Sports and Entertainment Law Group. It's Lori Eberhardt.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you for being here, Tim. Thank you for the invitation to the conference. This is really something I look forward to every year. It's a great, the people in the room are absolutely awesome and represent the best in our business. I've spent my life at speedways and in motorsports and dealing with legal issues with speedways, facilities, sanctioning bodies, spectators, participants, everything that you can think about. And I really appreciate being here, and hopefully we can provide you with some information that you can take back home and make your lives easier. Thank you.
And they say, oh, little clap here. There we go. They say motorsports is a tough business, but our next guest interned in an even crazier business, that of politics. Hashtag, are you crazy? After spending over 20 years with IndyCar, now she's with Andretti Autosport. It's Tiffany Hemmer.
Thank you, Dennis. I did actually start out in politics back in college and law school. And it's interesting because I think it kind of interweaves with every profession, but in motorsports you do see some politics also, just on a different scale. But I'm very excited to be here. I've been with IndyCar, I'm now with the team, so I'm kind of coming at it from a different standpoint, perspective. But everything still holds true. And then when I was at IndyCar, I had some crossover a little bit with IMS and track issues. So I'm very excited. It's interesting because I think we get as much out of this as hopefully you all do from the networking and just being able to call someone and ask about an issue and see if they've had that issue or if they can recommend someone to help on a particular topic. So thank you for inviting us.
And our next guest has been influential in the performance and development in both traditional and country club style facilities. His expertise has been added to deep roster at Driven International, who's been a very good friend to us here at the Racetrack Business Conference. It's Aaron Weiss.
Good afternoon. Firstly, just honored to be able to sit here and address my peers. It's a wonderful thing. Thank you very much for the invite. Brief history, I have a background in track operations. I think somebody mentioned this morning what a closed industry it is and how hard to get in, and I was lucky to stumble in, starting as a participant who happened to be a horrible mechanic. Meant that every weekend my car would break in the first session, which left me ample opportunity to volunteer and see what it took to run the course, which ended up being as much of a passion as participating for me. And I've segued that to track management and operations, always having a love for all things motorsport, including video games. You know, we joked this morning about the current generation. We call them this. Well, the old generation used to be this or this. And I think as I've seen these things evolve into legitimate tools and had the opportunity to work with the guys from Driven to see how things that were in some 13-year-old's basement as a game years ago are now tools that us as track designers, operators can really use has been exciting, and just great to be on the cutting edge of this kind of technology. And thank you very much.
That's just to get you exercise, so you burn off some calories before that great lunch later on today as well. All right, Lori, we're going to start off with you. E-waivers. Everybody's using them, not always using them wisely. What are the latest rules and concerns that you have about e-waivers from your point of view?
So you gave me the softball question right off at the front. There's been a lot of talk about electronic waivers and use of electronic waivers in our industry, and it applies from the facility standpoint, but also from the sanctioning body as well. We've all signed, I don't know, thousands, if not millions of waivers in our own careers, and our fans sign them all the time when they go into restricted areas. I want to be clear on one point with the e-waivers, and I want to everybody hear me when I say this. Our paper waiver system is not broken. Our paper waiver system is not broken. If you've got a paper waiver system and you're following your procedures and your processes and you're saving those waivers and you can find them, everybody is compliant with their insurance and compliant with defending that lawsuit. God forbid something should happen at your speedway. So our paper system is not broken. What's happening in our world, and it's a technology revolution, we're going from a paper world to a digital world. You have digital documents that you sign for your bank. You have digital documents for your car loan. You have digital documents for contracts. And these are enforceable documents. So we're just evolving into a digital system. And pretty soon we're going to be to the standard where electronic waivers are the standard, and we'll have systems in place that can legitimize the electronic waivers and protect the data in such a system that they're going to be used to be enforceable in court. What's happening, there's two things that you should know from a legal perspective. Number one, there's a federal rule, and I couldn't memorize the name, so I had to write it down. The Electronic Signatures in Global and National Commerce Act. It's a federal rule. And the federal rule says, of course, it's 1,000 pages long, and you can read it if you want to, if you have trouble falling asleep at night. But what the rule says is, just because it's your documents in an electronic format does not automatically mean it's invalid. Therefore, electronic documents are generally valid. Now, they must meet the same legal standards as paper documents, right? If you've got a contract, you've got offer, you've got acceptance, you've got consideration, you have all those things. Those same rules that have been around for hundreds of years in contract law are applicable to the electronic documents. So we're just evolving as humans evolve into a digital system. So there's the federal rule that says that electronic waivers, electronic contracts, electronic agreements are valid. And then there's a second a rule out there that the states have. And the states have a Uniform Electronic Transaction Act. The majority of the states have adopted this rule, and it says the same thing as the federal rule. It just says it at the state. So Indiana says, sure, electronic documents, just because they're electronic, are not necessarily void. As long as they meet the other legal standards of contracts, they're going to be enforceable. So what will happen in our industry is these electronic waivers, there's going to be technology and electronic systems developed that will follow the contract rules, the rules of authentication for evidence, and so the technology will get so good and will follow the existing rules where you will have an electronic system. There's some benefits to electronic system. It's digital, it can capture more data, but there's also some problems. You need to make sure that your documents are authenticated, that they're stored, that nobody can hack into your data and disrupt it. So it presents some challenges, but I think electronic waivers are just a natural evolution of our industry and in our sport. And just be on the lookout there. There's going to be some products that I think you'll see in the market that can provide the protections that are needed on these electronic waivers.
Tiffany, how different are the laws and rules that, sanctioning bodies have to be aware of, or even race teams have to be aware of as they move across the country? Different laws in different parts of the country and different countries.
It is interesting. At Andretti, we have 5 series. So we have Verizon IndyCar Series, Indy Lights, and then you've got Global Rallycross, Formula E, and now we have supercars in Australia. So we crisscross just about every line you can probably think of. And sometimes it's a trial and error. You learn, you talk to other teams, the sanctioning body, and you learn what the rules are. If you kind of divide it, and this is how I thought of it when we were preparing for the panel, the on-track portion is really controlled by the sanctioning body. So a lot of the rules, the rule book, the waivers, everything tie back to, say, for example, Indiana for the IndyCar Series or Verizon IndyCar Series. So you look at something like Australia is going to be different. So you really aren't talking about that. You're talking about all the other things that go with it. So I broke it in my mind down into you have people and you have equipment. So how you move those items to and from events. When you look at people, the big issue I think a lot of people need to focus on, if they're not already, is independent contractors versus employees, because that gets to be pretty sticky. And especially here in the States, the IRS has started to clamp down on that. So you look at the factor test, you figure out the default generally is that you're an employee, and so the burden's pretty heavy that you need to meet those requirements, the majority of them to be a contractor. So I would say for people to really look thoroughly at that. In addition, when you start crossing, it's not necessarily in the States, but into other countries, you end up with immigration issues. You've got visas. Do you need a visa to go from here to there? If you're hiring someone, do they have the visa to come work for you here? And you can imagine in the current political climate, crossing back into my prior life, but things are getting a lot harder as far as having people come to the States, get certain visas, and be able to work here. So sometimes your lead time's a lot further out. And even something like Canada, when I was with IndyCar and we started racing in Toronto, we had learned from Champ Car that had raced there before to know about certain issues. And we were very fortunate, but one of them was that DUIs in the States are treated much more seriously in Canada. And there's a reciprocal agreement between Canada and the United States. So their records pop up. So when you show your driver's license or passport, if you have had a prior issue, you need to have declared it and done something called rehabilitation. If you haven't, there's potential they can stop you at the border and turn you around. So you could imagine if you're a sanctioning body, if you're a team, all of a sudden it could be your driver, it could be your right front tire changer, and you're going to be scrambling over the weekend to figure out how you can get other people. And if there's a visa involved, you may not be able to visa somebody else, or maybe you needed to have some extras that were on the list from the beginning just to give you some flexibility. So that was somewhat surprising, but something that now we know, and all the teams, the manufacturers, everyone knows, okay, about 6 months out, start asking those questions, because it can take some time to navigate those waters with Canada, and you usually need to have an attorney involved just to make sure you're doing everything you need to. And usually once you do that once, then you're pretty good after that point. But it was just something that was kind of intriguing. You wouldn't have expected that, given the close proximity of the two countries. And, there's free flow, you just need your driver's license way back when. And so it just wasn't something I had anticipated until we were told that, and we researched it before the first issue arose. That was helpful for IndyCar. When we started going, it's interesting tying into club racing. So our first club track at IndyCar was Barber Motorsports Park. And when you talk about states and federal laws, so Alabama has an age of majority that's 19. So most people wouldn't have expected that. You'd think it's 18. So how does that affect credentialing your guests, your driver, your crew members, different people who are participating in the event? How is it they can do that? And you figure out ahead of time. Again, you don't want to have problems race weekend. If you can, at least me, I like to plan ahead of time, so I don't want to have to be dealing with these fire drills at the last minute. Japan had 20. So again, those are just questions you ask. When IndyCar went to Australia, and with supercars, I now can piggyback off that knowledge, but we knew it was 18 because we knew to ask the question. So sometimes you don't know what you don't know, and you just try to, through as many avenues as possible, find out as much as you can. And then segueing over quickly into equipment, you've got the tractors, you have federal legislation on emissions, EPA, you've got California that was more advanced and progressive and instituted some things ahead of time. Usually if you talk with your vendors, and that's what at Andretti, our person has done. And so, for example, there's e-logs coming online in about a week. So if you didn't know that, but your truck drivers are going to have to start doing their logs electronically. So that's coming. And how do you find out about these things? It's through conferences such as this. I'm on several law firm email distribution lists. I'm not entirely sure how I got on them, but they send periodic updates on, it could be legislation that was passed in your state, other issues of importance, for example, independent contractors, employees. So anything you can do along those lines usually helps. And just to close, when I talked to our chief operating officer, who's from England, and so I asked him, I said, what was kind of the number one aspect from this topic? And he said when he moved from England to the States, he was surprised. Each state is almost like its own country in some ways. And he used the example cell phone use when you're driving. No state is the same, and certain counties sometimes are different. So when you rent a car and you go somewhere, can you just jump in the car? Do you have to be hands-free? Can you use your phone or not? And then you get some ticket because you violated a law you didn't know about. So there are aspects like that that just come into play. And I thought it was interesting. It wasn't what I expected him to say.
Aaron Driven is doing some amazing things. What are some of the tools that are available to racetrack owners and promoters, whether they're building a new facility or with our aging infrastructure now, they're adding some safety improvements to existing ones?
Yeah, we're doing some really unique and fascinating stuff, but very quickly before I jump into that, I just want to touch base on a couple other aspects of the e-waiver. As a track operator, I was the annoying one constantly calling the lawyers to say, how far can we push it? What can we do? Why? And here's a couple things to think about. We talked about the fan experience. We talked about the VIP experience, the customer journey. What do people want to do? From the country club aspect, you have regular attendance at the same club. They should be known. They want to feel like when you pull up, they know who I am. When you drive an hour to get to your club and you pull up and the first thing you have to do is wait in queue to sign a waiver that I've signed 50 times, this starts a level of agitation that you can hopefully completely circumvent. So I think the potential of digital waivers would really help us with the experience, the customer experience. Similarly, one of the reasons why so many motorsports country clubs still host other events, in addition to adding to the bottom line revenue, is it's a great way to bring in potential members. So one of the questions I think we should circle back to maybe is, what is the legality of capturing that data for alternate use? In theory, if you're capturing all this data for a digital waiver, could you cross-reference this data to your existing database and see if these are customers who are already on your radar or should be on your radar?
It all depends on what the fine print says.
and how fine. So,
Well, and I was going to say, we're going through that right now because at Andretti we have shop tours. So you have groups that come in and you show them around, tell them different things, and you have certain rules and requirements, and what does the fine print say about what they can or can't do, and what can we do with their data. But we're looking at trying to do e-waivers for that. And if you're like me, if you've ever had to dig through a box, a dusty, musty old box in archives anywhere, looking for a waiver that is partially executed. Sometimes it'll have a scribble. They won't have printed the name. You won't have much on the date or the affiliation. You'll really appreciate e-waivers. And I was one of the ones that held out for a long time.
And you'll be surprised how many you find on there that are signed as Daffy Duck or otherwise. But to circle back to the original question you asked, I think one of the most interesting, exciting things that we're doing at Driven is we're using 3D modeling. Just interesting question, show of hands. How many of you have tried these new virtual reality goggles for any application? That's great. It's a lot, and these things are really coming online, and we're using them for a huge variety of things, everything from operational to commercial to design. So let's start at the onset of a track project. Historically, a lot of the people who are building tracks, changing tracks, are not necessarily engineers themselves. I am not. I've been involved in the process of modifying tracks, rebuilding courses, and we've seen a lot of two-dimensional digital output. Myself personally, and as I found, a lot of stakeholders in these projects have a really difficult time translating what a two-dimensional drawing, an engineering drawing that's usually heavy in layers of different data, is actually going to appear once it's built. There are an immense amount of courses that have been started and then you know the drill. You're out there on the graded ground driving in a truck, and this just isn't going to work, or the driver feedback isn't there, and you end up stopping projects and going back and making changes. So from a development standpoint, the ability to take a two-dimensional model, make it a three-dimensional model, put on a set of virtual reality goggles, get in and drive your track or the modification to your track, see what the sight lines look like, where the distances are. It's an invaluable tool that de-risks the project in a variety of ways. It de-risks the project from a development standpoint of having to go back and repair these changes, but even more so from the insurance company standpoint, from our building and safety standards standpoint. You put up a certain height wall for added safety, but you don't realize that it cuts the sight line to another corner. Another challenge of this as it affects the country club model is that country club courses are challenged with the complexity of the course. On the one hand, you're hopefully bringing new people into the sport, which I think is why the country club model has been successful. It's a great opportunity for people to come in and learn as they grow. So you don't want a course that's incredibly complicated and difficult to learn on. But on the other hand, you also want to keep people engaged and allow them to progress over time. So to achieve that fine balance with only a two-dimensional drawing is very difficult. To have the ability to put something on a model and to go out and actually drive it puts you, I think, a leg up in a lot of aspects. Now, once you have the model, the other uses are infinite. The commercial uses. As you're putting together sponsorship presentations, you can easily go into your model and paint your sponsor signs where they are and then show them what it'll be like from a mom and pop participant base where your sponsors are aimed at the drivers. You might want signs placed differently than if you're a spectator-based facility where you want signs aiming at grandstands. And these are all different things that you can use 3D models to preview before you ever build. Incredibly unique opportunities. There's the safety, there's the commercial aspect. I think there's a perception that this online racing craze is some sort of a competition and that people are going to end up doing this instead of getting out. And I think that's the wrong way to look at it. I think it is an incredible gateway for all of us. If you have the opportunity to have your course somewhere out there in the digital world where people can try it before they come, you are going to engage more people. People are going to try it. People are going to compete. There's a larger pool who have access to these online who will then gauge an interest and want to come out. And I think finding ways to work with them is going to be our future. Even from the standpoint of driver orientation, I think it's another key component. Historically, when I first started operating tracks, we had some regulations that you had to, before you competed on the track, you had to drive at street speed and do some sort of orientation. And I know that in our world and our events have changed and the attention span and duration has changed, and we no longer have events where you all have to show up in the morning and do an orientation. We'd like to have the flexibility to come and go as you please. I think I see a future where all courses will have a digital model on site, and you will have to do an orientation before you are signed off to go on the course. I think that certainly de-risks the whole experience, and it's something that we should all move towards.
Before I throw out a toss-up question, I want to give an opportunity to the audience to ask, because I know, for one, I know how much lawyers bill on an hourly basis. Any questions from the class? You're all amazed that the old man can still move.
Major League Baseball has their waiver on the back of their ticket. And my wife and I were at a game, and we were behind the on-deck circle, and a foul ball came back and hit a guy right in the face, and it was the most god-awful sound we had ever heard. And so there's a risk in all sports, all forms of sports entertainment. Do we ever see drag racing or motorsports in general going to a printed disclaimer on a ticket rather than this whole signature process?
It's a really good question. And there's a couple of things that the release does. Number one, it's a release of all liability is one thing. The person who signs the release also agrees to indemnify the releasee. If there's an accident, you get sued, you got to pay money back. And the third thing that's in there is called an assumption of the risk defense. And in these lawsuits, when somebody gets injured on your spectator or participant, one of the number one defenses is assumption of the risk. You're going to say that participant, that crew guy, has been to 100 different races. They knew what they were getting into, and they assumed the risk. And that's a 100% defense to any kind of negligence claim. That's just a legal background. Most speedways, when I was at Charlotte Motor Speedway, and I was their attorney for 12 years, and Speedway Motorsports was the attorney for 8 of the SMI Bruton's tracks for 12 years, we went to a disclaimer on the back of the ticket. But this problem with the back of the ticket, you can put that, and it can support your defenses. You can have an assumption of the risk. You can have an indemnification and a release. Because of the space limitation, it's limited in what you can say there. Also, it's got to be big enough so somebody can read it. You know, you've got to have 12 point. You can't just have little. If the guy says, I didn't know what I signed because it was too small, I couldn't read it, that would invalidate your release. So I think a best practice is to have a disclaimer on your ticket. The other thing to include on your tickets is also the ticket holder gives you, the track owner, the right to use their likeness in marketing purposes. So you may have a crowd shot that you want to use in your program, or you may have some fun thing that you're doing. If you've got language on the back of your ticket where that ticket owner, does it sound better if I talk like this? When that ticket owner gives you the right to use their likeness for promotional and marketing purposes, that's something that should go on the back of your ticket. So I think best practices from a facility standpoint is to have release language on your ticket, and then also have the release language to go into those restricted areas. You're not going to have every single spectator sign a release. You don't want to. You don't want people afraid to come to your speedway, right? From the spectator perspective, you want them to come. It's those participants and your drivers that are in those really restricted areas where you want to have your releases. Does that answer the question?
Any more questions from the class?
Thank you for the free legal advice here. I'm going to take advantage of it.
It's worth what you pay for it.
I got it. I get it. Let me ask you, you've talked about how to protect the promoter, but talk about the other people that are involved with the building of a track. You know, we build temporary road circuits and permanent road circuits, and every time there is a catastrophic event, and God forbid somebody gets hurt, and it's going to happen, not when, but it will, I'm not sure if you agree or disagree, but it happens. We're mentioned in the lawsuit. How do we protect ourselves? I mean, how far down the food chain do these lawsuits go? And I see them go deep, from the track designer to the car manufacturer to the team, you know, and it just seems like the promoter is kind of a lot of times, well, hey, it's your problem.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll take it, and then you may have something to add from a construction standpoint. You have to assume, God forbid, that catastrophic event happens at your speedway, everybody's going to get sued. The promoter gets sued. If you're in a municipality, you're in a temporary course, the city's going to get sued, the municipality, the builder, the designer, everybody. And there's one overarching standard that's going to be litigated in the whole thing. Were you reasonable, and did you meet an industry standard? If you're building a temporary track and you cut corners and you don't put the Jersey barrier in the proper places, if you don't have your due diligence done with your designers of this is how fast the cars are going to go, these are where the projectiles are going to go, this is where we need to have fencing. If you cut corners on your construction or your design and you don't meet that industry standard, you're going to be held liable. And that's what we want. We want people to build things that are safe, that are within reason. You can't build something that's indestructible. Just a little side note, a lot of times on the oval tracks, when you have debris, you have tires that go into the grandstands, and you have debris that gets outside the catch fence. Well, do you build a plexiglass wall, or do you build a net over the top so the tires can't get out? Well, the engineering would have to be so strong and so impenetrable, but also you can't see through it. So why do you have this big, something you can't see through? You defeat your whole business purpose. So for a temporary facility or any kind of facility that you're building, you must meet the industry standard. And how do you meet that? Hire somebody that builds speedways, or do a survey yourself. Let's go to all these temporary tracks. These are best in class. Well, let's meet that standard or something close. So it's a reasonableness, and it's also meeting the industry standard, no matter it's your construction, it's your catch fence, it's the way your pits are set up, it's where your gates are on the outside, and where you're having your crowd control. If you've got a corner or something, and oftentimes you've got some debris or a projectile that goes over in a certain place, let's put some fencing and don't allow your spectators to stand there. That's my thoughts.
I think when you're following the badass attorney, there's not that much you can add. I will say, from an operator standpoint, and with the background now that I have in design, I think the simple question is, when you don't know, ask. There are resources in the industry, use them. We understand that to generate interest and create fans, you change things, you bring people in, you try new stuff, you make temporary changes, utilize your resources, call your designer. We're thinking about using this area that's normally parking for a drifting practice day. What is it that we have to do to meet that standard? Call and ask. That's what the designers are there for. The insurance companies can give you some guidance on that too. And I think you'd always rather ask than guess. That's the simple.
One thing I would second, your insurance companies will be a great resource to you. They'll, even if you ask them, they'll come in and do a full audit of your facility, and they'll take a look at what you've got, and they will give you recommendations. If you go through an attorney, it can be privileged. That's a way to do it, so that can't be discoverable. But your insurance company is a great resource.
That's what I was going to add to. I constantly probably annoy to that level my insurance agent. So whoever it is, when I was with IndyCar or in Andretti, I'm always forwarding materials if it's a press release, if it's some diagram or a picture, or here's an idea of what we're trying to do, just to make sure that I'm running traps, because you're right. I mean, you can get so much advice in doing it right, and even some things aren't, should it be in writing, should it not be? Sometimes you have handshake deals, and so when does it rise to the level of needing to have something in writing, and then what's that insurance provision say? And the wording on the back of the ticket has come in handy in the last few years, especially with weather-related issues. So just even having procedures and planning and meetings and a crisis plan, that can go a long way. And again, you're working with some of these other groups. For example, your medical or emergency or police departments, and then your insurance company all trying to do it on the front end. So, hopefully you never have to pull that out of that drawer, but you are supposed to have periodic training and refreshers on it. But there have been some cases recently, and then they go back to the language, because the person sitting in the grandstand just had a ticket. They didn't sign a credential waiver and go into a restricted area. And so you're right. I mean, as far as, can you post something at an entrance to, the track or the garage, or just thinking about how you get people around, moving them from in and out and all, and being reasonable goes a long way.
And great job of promoting a later panel too, because we will have our sports insurance specialist up here on the podium, along with a legal mind that's so great we had to bring her back a second time later in the day. So if you have any questions about those subjects as well, we'll have a second opportunity when it comes to legal and risk management later on in the show. Any other questions from the audience? Okay, I'm going to throw a toss-up out while I'm going there, and you guys can take this. One thing I've learned, no, I'm not a lawyer, but I stayed at Holiday Inn Express once. The answer of we've always done it this way is not a legal defense, I understand. What's the most infuriating thing that you've discovered that either a race team or an organization has been doing that was really opening themselves up to a lot of problems? You don't have to name names.
We are not going to name any names. There is a proliferation of short attention span entertainment venues based in motorsport. I understand it. I think it's a great business. I think it needs a little bit more fine-tuning. I think when you're attracting a really wide range of participants, you need to perhaps spend more time and energy with basic education, particularly some very fundamental issues. So what did we find that was really surprising? Groups that were teaching orientation in English, yet a certain percentage of their clients spoke no English. Why? Perfect example. Now, this has been rectified, changed, thank God, but that's one of the things we've encountered looking at, it's a global economy now. Tourism is from everywhere. Be prepared that all of your systems are in place for potentially anybody who could show up.
David Vodden, Thunder Hill Raceway, the one in California. Lawsuit several years ago had 6-point type on the back of a ticket, and it was thrown out because of that. But the question is there's a current lawsuit in California involving standards of the industry, specifically a debate over certain conditions and such as to the nature of the racetrack's design. And we heard from Mr. Martin, I believe it was, in years past, about trying to uniform standards and create these very specific, and I believe that this case and a lot of track issues rest on the inability to demonstrate a requirement to comply with specifics. So standards of the industry is a big deal. Where is it going, and where is it today, and where is it going?
It's a really good question, David, and thanks for answering it. There is no uniform. We don't have a code. We don't have a uniform motorsports code, or we don't have a design code. It's different than if you've got the American concrete, the book that has all the concrete rules, and this is how we build concrete bridges, and you meet it or you don't. I think the way we do it today, number one, it promotes evolution. You want to have a safe facility. You want to protect your participants. You want to have best in class. And so it's a natural, it's purely capitalism, right? You want to have the best speedway out there. You want to protect your spectators and your participants, and you're going to do what's right. The problem with having those are good and bad, pros and cons with having a uniform standard. Number one, you have a uniform standard. If you meet it, you're good. If you don't meet it, you're not. You've got a really bright line test. Anybody that doesn't meet the bright line test, they're negligent, and they're going to be, the lawsuit's going to win. On the other hand, once you set the standard, everybody has to meet it. So it may put some people out of business. It may put some challenges for people that can't meet a minimum standard. So it's going to cut both ways. There's a benefit and there's a cost to it as well. I think we have a self-policing. We are all in a lot of trouble if people think, if I'm going to go to the speedway, I'm going to get hurt. I better not go. I do it when I go to the baseball game. I'm like, if I'm sitting down, I'm not sitting down first base or third base. I'm sitting behind the fence because you've seen too many things happen at baseball games. I also don't go in the hot pits. I'm very, very risk averse. So we want people to be safe, and you want them to feel safe. And I think we need to self-regulate and keep looking. Well, that person's doing it better over there. Let me go talk to him. Let me go see what's going on at these country club tracks. How can we do it better? How can we be more safe and really self-regulate? It'll be interesting to see how that case comes out in California. In California, as you know, is a whole different jurisdiction. But as California goes, that's the way the rest of the country goes. So that's where the new law is made.
It is interesting. I can add a little from my time at IndyCar. And because you had the FIA, which is the global group, and then it trickles down, so there are grade licenses for tracks for certain series to run at. So, you'd have a grade 1, grade 2, 3, 4, that type of thing. And while they focused on certain types of tracks because that's where their experience was, then you'd have them come in and inspect it, you'd make any changes. They'd issue a certificate that was good for 3 years. So when you talk about layers, and I know Joe's here from K&K, I'm sure, well, we've never had to show this certificate that has a nice big gold stamp on it and all. I mean, it's very impressive looking. But, having more sets of eyes look at it and someone like that that's a recognized body. So when you're talking about industry standard, I completely get that there may not be some for certain tracks, and each track is so different, it's hard. And when we were talking with the Smith Fence folks about the safer barrier, just as background, there was a time when people didn't want the safer barrier installed because it was too experimental. And so people didn't know if it was going to help or hurt. So at some point, you passed that threshold, and the same thing happened with the Hans device. You had people that didn't want to wear it at the beginning because it's like, okay, is that going to help me in a forward crash but hurt me in a backward crash? And then what's the right makeup of it? You don't want to have the law of unintended consequences and create something worse. So safer barriers become an industry standard now. So when you look at oval tracks over a certain distance, and then, but at a time it wasn't. And you had people, when Formula One came to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, I think the first time, they had the safer barrier removed because they were going the opposite direction if you think about the track. And then also it was just in such developmental phase at the time, they weren't sure. And now you fast forward 20 some odd years later, and you have Formula One that's working and installing safer barrier at Le Mans last year. And they've had it at Interlagos in Brazil. So again, some of it's evolution and keeping in touch with that, and all the folks in this room or your insurance companies and all, I mean, that goes a long way, and you realize, there isn't going to be that answer you'll have, well, you should do the fence this way or that way. So there may not be a right answer, but as long as sometimes you've been conscious about it, deliberate, you've considered, you've got all of that in your favor.
I just want, my name is Daffy Broom from Apex Circuit Design. I just wanted to add a bit about the FIA and the FIM, the international regulating authorities for the sport. They do have their own guidance and standards for the design of course construction. It does cover a wide majority of facilities, from karting all the way through to motor racing tracks. The way that the licensing system works actually allows the FIA or the FIM to assess the designs based on runoff area sizes, based on simulations that are carried out by the FIA using the fastest likely vehicle for that grade of track. So their simulation is science-based and mathematically based, and allows for things like runoff area sizes to be adjusted according to the likelihood of an accident. In addition, the FIA and the FIM put a lot of effort into research, and they spend a lot of money in testing products. And there are specific designs and products that are listed that are approved by these bodies that you can then use, that then allows for the, I suppose, for you to demonstrate that you've achieved the industry standard. So, we always encourage our clients to go for international licensing for their tracks, as much for the litigation than anything else, really.
Yeah, I'd like to just add, I think, a great point there, and point taken. I think another thing to consider for existing courses is as you do modifications and changes, there's absolutely no harm in building those areas and modifications of changes to the modern FIA standards. Once you've reached a point where you can certify the entire track, that's a decision you make at that point. But I think for building, there is a distinction between building to the standard and actually completing the complete certification. I've actually been in a couple facilities that, as we've upgraded, we've added those elements to make sure that the elements we're adding, where it just wasn't cost effective to redo the entire thing. So keep in mind as you move forward, keep adding those elements, speak with a proper track designer, and they'll make sure they are, and then you'll hopefully reach the point where you can certify the whole thing. Any further questions? Okay.
We've got time
Good morning. Mike Cohen with V8 Road Racing West. We're a traveling road racing stock car series on the West Coast. And so we go to different tracks. I'm curious on the e-waiver side of things for entrance. Does the e-waiver have to be signed at the actual event, or can it be done online when you're entering through Motorsports Reg or anything else like that? What's the best policy for that?
Great question. It's going to depend on the technology that's developed. I think we're going to see the development of technology where you can sign your waiver in your home before you go to the track. You have two situations. Number one, you've got the competitors that are signing the waiver, their annual pass because they're participating and they're traveling with the circuit, and then they're signing the release when they get to the event to get into the speedway. So there's technology. Again, the technology has to meet all the evidentiary requirements and has to meet the legal standards of those particular states. But once that's met, and the technology that you could be traveling to, what's the track you go to? Okay, you're going to Willow Springs next week. You're in your office, and you can pull up your e-waiver, and it identifies you, it verifies your signature. You do it right there on your thing, on your mobile phone, in your office, and you pay for it or whatever you have to do. And then once you get to the track, you've got a scan or a barcode that you automatically go in. No standing in line, no doing anything. That's a benefit with the technology. Again, that technology has to be state of the art, and it's got to meet all those rules. But I think we're going to see that come into the sooner rather than later. And it would be a huge benefit. And again, to the customer service aspect, stand in that pit line, 20 people deep. Everybody's there at 6 a.m. trying to get in. This is all done ahead of time.
Another great question. And if you have any other legal questions, you get to save them until later on in the day. I run a tight ship around here.
You certainly do.
Aaron, your final words, sir.
Thanks again for the opportunity to address. Really is an honor. I mentioned a lot of different aspects for how we can use these 3D models. I think some of you key into some of them more than the others as they appeal to a wide range. We do have a lot of models where this isn't a dream that's down the road. These are things we're doing today and delivering to clients as we speak. Myself and our managing director, Ben Wilshire, are both here. We have plenty of examples. If you have a further interest, please pull us aside. We'd love to sit down with you and show us some of the examples of what we're doing.
Tiffany.
I wear some other hats, so I have an FIA role that I'm involved in, and then also I'm an ACUS board member. One thing I would suggest is don't forget about ACUS. And so that's the group for the United States, Automobile Competition Committee for the United States. It's a division of FIA for here. So they're in Colorado. You can always pick up a phone and call. And again, they're a great resource. So if you haven't got a contact on a particular issue or a topic, they might be able to suggest something. And it ties in a little bit to what you were saying, that some of these things, it's a broad spectrum.
Lori.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate the comments and the questions. If there's anybody has any questions about risk management, how to minimize it, we pride ourselves on being business lawyers. We're not the lawyer that's going to make you sign these unreasonable releases and have these things that totally jam up your customer service, because we understand your business model has to work first, or else there's no risk to mitigate. Would love to help you and answer any kind of questions you have. Thank you.
So what did we learn from this group? First of all, I learned that you go to the specialists that know this sport when it comes to the legal side of things. That's an extra bonus. But the paper waiver system is not broken. We're just evolving to a more electronic world. Know the rules in advance for your protection. The worst time to learn about rules is on race weekend. The number two thing, could we be breaking the rules by how we capture and use data? Think about everything that you're doing and make sure that you're in compliance, because the legal aspects and the penalty could be a lot worse than what you gain. And finally, what used to be games, I find this so cool. What used to be games are now providing us the 3D data not only to help us race safer and race better and have a more exciting track, but also help us from the marketing angle. I never thought of that. So for our risk management group, big applause.